I wonder, do you know the comedian Jeff Foxworthy? And you all remember this guy? He has made a living on the one-liner joke that he has been writing for years and years and years. He's got t-shirts and calendars and mugs and websites. I mean, this guy has made a fortune on writing one-liner jokes on one topic. You might be a redneck if. And I feel safe that I can talk about these jokes because I am from the South. I have been accused in time to time of being a redneck. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you're in luck. I've got a couple of my favorite ones that Jeff wrote. Have you heard this one? You might be a redneck if you cut your grass and you find a car. Now, I might be guilty of having a few folks like that in my family that have found cars out in the woods and they didn't even know they had it. Or how about this one? You might be a redneck. This is bad. If you go to a family reunion to meet women, that's so bad. I hope I don't get in trouble for that one. Here's another one that I love. You might be a redneck if your dad walks you to school because you're in the same grade. That's not funny. Or how about this one? This is another one of my favorites. You might be a redneck if you think the last 4 words of the Star-Spangled Banner is "Gentlemen, start your engines," right? From NASCAR. And I was thinking about Jeff Foxworthy's jokes, ironically, when I was studying and preparing the last couple weeks for this sermon on control in our Resist series. Why, you ask? Well, I started thinking, what if we were presented with a list that maybe isn't as funny as Jeff Foxworthy's "You might be a redneck if" jokes, that helped us to sort through if we struggle with a particular sin, or to help us understand how sin or bad decisions or something we might struggle with manifests itself in our lives. So I did a lot of reading and studying over the last couple weeks and read a lot of articles on the issue of control. In our culture, we might call it being a control freak, right? And so I came up with a list. These admittedly are not as funny as Mr. Foxworthy's jokes, but I want to go through some stuff that I've grouped together and see if you identify with any of these symptoms and see if you have an issue of control. Here's a couple. You might struggle with control if you refuse to delegate. Does that ring a bell for you in your life? Or you might struggle with control issues if everything always has to be on your timing. What about this one? You might struggle with control issues if you are a perfectionist. You might struggle with control issues if you judge others to make yourself ultimately feel better. What about you might struggle with control issues if you were hurt by someone in the past? And I just want to pause real quick on that one because most of you are probably thinking, well, of course, I've got hurts in my past. Everyone does. But someone who struggles with control issues, maybe something insignificant that to other people became a big deal, and it triggered you, and you felt like you lost control or you felt less than, and either consciously or subconsciously, you decided for the rest of your life, you're not going to be out of control and be made to feel that way ever again. Why? Because you were hurt. Some trauma happened in your past. You might struggle with control issues if you want other people to fit your expectations, and not just healthy expectations, but you want them to fit your unhealthy, unrealistic expectations that you can't even live up to. What about this? You might struggle with control issues if you don't share success. You feel threatened when other people get success alongside of you because, like we've learned in the last few weeks of our Resist series from our lead pastor, Dave, makes you feel insignificant. Or you might struggle with control issues if you think you know best in every situation. It's your way or the highway. You're the smartest person in the room. Or how about this last one? You might struggle with control issues if you struggle to maintain meaningful, healthy relationships long term. So many of us battle with control. And if you are feeling convicted right now, if you're hearing this and I went through this list of 9 my redneck jokes, you struggle with control issue points, and you're feeling inside like, ugh, I identify with some of those. I just want to encourage you, okay? Like don't click off. I remember the last 2 weeks sitting at our Dormont location where I have the privilege to pastor and hearing Pastor Dave do something similar to this. Like, here's ways you can identify if you struggle with the topic that we are speaking on. And I was sitting on the front row and he would finish that list and I just had a pit in my stomach because I thought, yeah, I struggle with those things. And please, Pastor Dave, don't go any further. I'm convicted and I don't want to dive into this. But friends, I want to encourage you, if you're feeling that today, that's a good thing. Because that's the Holy Spirit of God speaking into your life and challenging in you in this area to take a step towards real security and not in false control that you think you have. And in weeks 2 and 3 of this series, as I said, Pastor Dave taught us, did a phenomenal job. Go back and watch those if you haven't had a chance to catch weeks 2 and 3. But he touched on King Saul's need for acceptance and the mistakes that he made, and they're recorded in a book called 1 Samuel in chapter 15. And I want you to remember that Pastor Dave taught us that the king of Israel was supposed to stay in his lane, if you will. He was supposed to tend to military strategy, the protection of the people, the governance of the nation, and then there were the prophets. And in this season, we have the prophet Samuel. And Samuel was the voice of God, if you will. God spoke through Samuel to the people, and it was his job to be anointed and to care for the spiritual needs of the people. And King Saul in chapter 15, as we've already learned, made some really, really bad decisions. He longed to be accepted in the eyes of mankind, and he ended up paying dearly with the consequences for his disobedience. And so today we're going to dive in once again into chapter 15 and just keep peeling the layers off of the onion of this man's life. Now remember, so God tells King Saul through the prophet Samuel, I want you to go to war with this group, the Amalekites. And in doing so, God's command was that they were to spare no one. They were not to spare any item of value, no matter how costly it was, because of how purely the Amalekites treated the Israelites when they were coming out of Egypt, completely destroy this nation. So Saul gathers the people together, they go up to fight, and they end up totally destroying the Amalekite nation. Good, right? Like, Saul was obedient, right? Everything's gonna be just fine, right? Unfortunately, no, because Saul, in this moment after the battle is over, made a grave mistake in where he chose to place his security. And so here's where we pick the story up. Chapter 15, verses 9 through 10. Listen. But Saul and the people spared this guy Agag. He was the king of the Amalekites. And not only did they spare the king, but they spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fatted calves and of the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless, they devoted to destruction. And so all this comes back. The word of the Lord comes to Samuel. He hears from God, and God says to Samuel, I regret that I have made Saul king. He's turned his back from following me and has not performed my commands. And Samuel was angry, and it says that he cried all night long to the Lord. You see, when you try to control a situation, just like King Saul, oftentimes you will control because you think that you know better. God's command was clear to Saul. Utterly destroy the Amalekites. Yet Saul and the people he was supposed to lead spared Agag and all the things that they thought were good. I mean, why waste, right? Did God really mean everything? But you see, partial obedience is actually disobedience. And Saul didn't stand up to the people that he was supposed to lead and fulfill the commands of God. Saul wanted to control the situation because he thought he knew better. Did God really say that? Is that really what he meant? Oftentimes, whether consciously or subconsciously, we do the same thing in our lives. We take God out of the driver's seat. We fail to remember that he is our security. And whether we understand what he's doing at the moment or not, we fail to yield control back over to God. Once again, because he's our security. But notice also that Saul, he wanted to take credit. Oftentimes we will control a situation because we want credit. Listen to verse 12. And Samuel rose early to go meet Saul in the morning. This is going to be a tough meeting, right? And it was told to Samuel, so as Samuel comes into the camp, if you will, as he nears into this battle, it was told to Samuel, hey, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself, and he turned and passed on and went down to Gilgal. Now, again, last week, Pastor Dave taught us about this moment. God gives the victory, but Saul tries to take control of the situation, and he wants to steal credit. Saul, for some unknown reason, heads out and decides to build a monument for himself. And like Pastor Dave said last week, I thought it was so good that here's Saul, in our vernacular, he's trying to build his brand, right? And if we're honest, times when we attempt to take control of a situation, we do it because we want credit and we want the accolades for ourselves. But a lot of times we also try to control because we want to manipulate the situation. Let's read on in verses 20 through 21. And Saul said to Samuel, I've obeyed the voice of the Lord. I've gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me. I've brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and I've devoted the Amalekites to destruction. But the people took the spoil of the sheep and the oxen and the best of the things, and they devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. So Saul is the king, right? He's the leader. But what does he say? He says, when confronted by Saul, now he blames the issue on the people. Oh, it wasn't me, it was them. Saul could have repented. He could have owned up to his disobedience, but instead he passes the blame off to someone else in order to try to control the situation because he knows it's spiraling out of control and he's made a mistake. Controlling people have a hard time accepting blame. When confronted with a wrong or constructive criticism, regardless of who it's from, it turns to a threat in their mind. It turns to a threat of the job that they've just performed. And as a result, oftentimes, rather than rest in the security of a God who says who we are, we're offended inside and we respond by manipulating and rewriting what happened so that we look good and we can get out of the situation. But we also oftentimes will control because we want to determine the outcome. Listen to 24 through 28. So Saul replies to Samuel, I've sinned. I've transgressed the commandment of the Lord in your words because I feared the people and I obeyed their voice. Now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may bow before the Lord. And Samuel says to Saul, I will not return with you because you've rejected the word of the Lord. And the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel because of his disobedience, right? And Samuel turned to go away, and Saul seized the skirt of his robe and he tore it. And Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. It's as if Saul doesn't hear anything Samuel is saying. He is so blinded by his sin and his attempt to control the situation. All he's concerned with is how are things gonna look if the prophet, the spiritual leader of our people, doesn't go out with me. Samuel's absence would indicate God's hand of blessing was removed from Saul, and he couldn't have that. Saul admits that he gave in to the people because he feared them, but now he's determined to control the outcome of this situation. He goes as far as to seize Samuel's robe and tear it. You see, controlling people want to always determine the outcome of a situation. They become blinded by their own selfishness, and they want to ensure that the outcome is always in their favor. But check this out. People who struggle with control oftentimes will control because you want to establish the narrative. Let me explain. Look at verses 30 and 31. And then Saul says again, I have sinned, yet honor me now before the elders of my people and before Israel, and return with me, that I may bow before the Lord your God. Pastor Dave talked about that last week. Not his God, your God. So Samuel turned back after Saul, and Saul bowed before the Lord. Saul wouldn't take no for an answer. He has to have Samuel return with him. So Samuel turns back and goes with Saul, but this is nothing more than a show. This is just political theater. This is Saul attempting to control the narrative in front of the people. Though all of this is a lie, he keeps pressing into the lies in order to spin the situation in his favor. And the sad reality, listen to this, the sad reality is that though he grasps for control so tightly, God ultimately sees the heart and he's already judged him. When we try to control a situation in the midst of our sinfulness and our poor decisions, we want to control what people think and feel and believe about us. We think if we can manipulate people and manipulate the narrative, then we will gain control back over what is happening and everything will stop spinning out of control. The problem is that God sees our hearts and our motives. But I want to shift gears just a little bit, because in this text, we have a verse and a section that really lends understanding into a common folly of humankind and ultimately our sinfulness. Because sadly, the most common area where most all of us try to control in our life is in the area of our finances and our generosity. Did you catch what Samuel said to Saul in verse 22? Maybe you were reading along with me, or you heard Pastor Dave teach this last week. Listen to what Samuel says to it. He says, has the Lord a great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices? As in obeying the voice of the Lord? So he's saying, would he rather have all these sacrifices rather than you actually obey him? He says, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of those rams you were going to sacrifice to me. Saul has won. He's defeated the Amalekites, but selfishness creeps in. Wouldn't you ask the same question? Well, why kill the king? Why kill Agag? He's the symbol of my victory. Why kill all these animals? These are valuable possessions, God. This is the bounty of my obedience. At first glance, it kind of seems like God is being petty to count this sin and to take the throne away from Saul. Is this really disobedience? But I mentioned this early, and I want you to read this on the screen and really drill into this. Partial obedience is always complete disobedience. God promised to bless Saul and the children of Israel throughout generations. And in this moment of doing what he thought was good, Saul took control from God and missed out on the greater vision that the Lord had planned for him and the people. All the sacrifices that you make mean nothing if they aren't based in obedience to God's commands. Anything you can give to God is useless unless you have first heard his voice and followed through with obedience. Our security is found in hearing and obeying God, not in our riches and in our circumstances. The people of Israel saw the wealth that they could have, the security that they thought that it would bring, the way it was going to set them up for years and years and years. And why not? So they disobeyed God, and they chose to put their security in the riches that were right in front of them instead of in God. And this is a sad tale of time and history, isn't it? We live in such a way that we place our faith in what we see and touch instead of the promises of God to keep us secure. And as a result, over time, we become selfish and controlling with what God himself first blessed us with. And practically, we will place our security in what we have instead of the God who gave it to us in the first place. Generosity means nothing.
Financial freedom and finances and money means nothing if it isn't undergirded by radical obedience to his voice. Let's take a jump into the New Testament. The Apostle Paul writes to his young protege, Timothy, on this subject. Listen to what he tells Timothy to teach to the church and the people. He says, instruct those who are rich in this present age not to be arrogant or to set their hope on the uncertainty of wealth. Rather, do it and put it on God, who richly provides us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous, willing to share, storing up from themselves a good foundation for the age to come, so that they may take hold of what is real, what's real life. Greed is one of the most frequently mentioned sins in the Bible. Greed is often associated with being rich, but you don't have to be rich to be greedy, do you? We always think of someone who makes more money than us as someone who is rich. However, this passage speaks to a group of people who is particularly susceptible to greed, the rich. Now, when I wrote this, I know what you would be thinking. All right, I'm good through here. I struggle with control. Thank you for calling attention to that in my life. I'm going to do better. I don't have to listen to the rest of this because I'm not rich. We always think of somebody else is rich. But I'm convinced that in perspective of the world that you and I live in, we're rich. Rich is a matter of perspective. There are a lot of people who are rich right here in this town, or in the town where you live. And we tend to resent the rich. They don't pay their fair share. Or they earned it the wrong way. They had to have had. So today is easy. Yeah, let's just talk about those terrible rich people. I heard a sermon a number of years back, and I actually got the transcript from it. It was from a gentleman by the name of Ed Stetzer. He is a pastor and author and theologian and statistician, and he preached once about generosity, an entire series on generosity. He brought awareness, so I'm giving credit to him for this. It was so powerful because he brought awareness to what rich people are doing in towns and cities all across our great country. And I just want to share some of these that he brought to light that I was fascinated by. Let me tell you what's going on right here in our city and in the cities where you live. Did you know that some people make so much money that when they reach a certain age, they've got so much money collected up, they just stop working? They get some lawn furniture, they go sit on the driveway, and then look for ways to entertain themselves, like through shuffleboard or pickleball and other activities. And there's a word for it. They call it retirement. Can you believe that? Do you know there's some people who have so much money? They actually have so much money that there's some left over after they die. So they actually leave instructions, legal documents on how they want it spent. Unbelievable. Did you know happening in our country that there are some people who have so much money that they actually own a place to live? It's true. And then have so much extra land. Some of them have so much land that they actually don't grow food on it to eat. But they actually plant this green vegetation that they water and they fertilize and they mow it to make it look pretty, and they curse it during the summer. Do you know there are people that are so rich that they actually have a room in their house that has furniture in it, and it's set up and nobody lives in it? It's just there. Nobody lives in it. It's just there in case somebody wants to come over and sleep and be a guest. And you know that some people don't walk places with the legs that God gave them? Instead, they have these large mechanical devices with lights and heat and air conditioning and devices that play music whenever they drive around. And then get this, it's not just that bad. I'm sorry. But there's some of them have whole homes. They call them garages just for their cars. It's crazy. Some people just take days off of work and they go sit in trees or float around in boats just to kill animals and catch fish that they don't even eat. They just hang them on their wall and brag about it. And did you know that their companies still pay them while they're off? Some people have so much money that they just quit working for a couple weeks every year and they go have fun. I mean, they usually don't have fun because it's stressful because they got to figure out how to spend all the extra money that they have. And they plan it out and they go move into somebody else's house and they have a maid that cleans it every day and they force their families to go have fun. They call it vacation. Do you know that if you have an average income in the U.S., you're among the richest people in the world? This time in our history is the richest time in history. Census data shows that in 2020, the median household income in the United States of America was $67,521. That's rich. Rich is a matter of perspective, isn't it? Nobody wants to say they're rich because that's hard to accept. Listen to what Jesus recorded in Matthew chapter 6, 19 through 24 about this topic. He says, don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal it. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy and where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, listen, or where your security lies, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye's unhealthy, your whole body's going to be full of life. But if your eye is bad, then your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. He's either going to hate one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. Here's the payoff, friends. Here's the thesis. You can't serve God and money. Can't be greedy. Just like Saul in the Old Testament, too many people are worshiping their money and try to control their lives. And as a result, they have to make sacrifices to that God of greed and of money. Sacrificing our marriages, sacrificing our kids, sacrificing the purpose that God originally created us for, sacrificing our careers, sacrificing the lives of other people. What starts out as a lack of trust in the security of our good and heavenly Father turns into full-blown idolism. And we do anything we can to control it, and eventually it'll take over your life. Some of you, I hear you, Pastor, I just don't make that much money. I mean, I'm not rich. That's a lie. It's a lie from our culture, and it's a lie from Satan. There are few, if any, who are listening to me today that are not among the richest in our world. And the biggest issue that we haven't learned is to be content with God, understanding that even though we are among the richest of the world, we can give back and we can be a generous people. Most of us spend money that we don't have to keep up with people we don't even like. So how do you gain control and how do you release control of your finances? Let's got 3 quick things and we'll be done. I want you to give to God first. Start tithing through the local church. Start giving your tithe to the local church. So we say, as soon as I get out of debt, Pastor, that's what I'm going to do. Don't wait till you're out of debt. Start giving now and watch God do amazing things in your life as you release control and ownership back over to God as He originally intended it. This is an issue of control over ownership. God's the one that blessed us with it first. It's all His. He owns everything. And whether you realize this or not, your security is instantly thrust back into the arms of God when you give through the local church. Number 2, be generous to the poor and the hurting and the needy. The Bible is clear. It's our responsibility to care for the poor, to care for the hurting, to care for the broken. This isn't a social issue, friends. This is a gospel issue. It's not the government's job. It is the church's job to care for the poor. Look for ways to drop your control and judgmental attitudes and care for people all around you who are in need. God will judge you and the church and me on how well we cared for those who are the most vulnerable and broken among us. This isn't just the corporate church's job. It's our responsibility individually every single day to be on the lookout for those whom God can bless through our generosity. Give to God first. Be generous to the poor, hurting, and needy. But what about this one? Start with a percentage. The Bible is clear. And I'm amazed how many people are resistant to giving back to God through the local church based on a percentage in their budget. We will budget and percent everything else out except for the command of God to tithe back to the local church. And people will ask, should it be 10%, Pastor? Should it be 30% or more like the Israelites were commanded to in the Old Testament? I think those are the wrong questions. I tell people all the time, you should give back to God's church until you feel it, until you notice it. And then also, second step, you should give back to God's church until it feels good. I found too many Christ followers just tip God. And there is freedom in resting in the security of the Lord. And only those who tithe can fully experience it. Have you ever seen those? I'm just fascinated by these men and women, the folks who can spin the basketballs on their fingers and shoulders and feet. And, they do the trick shows at halftimes and NBA games and stuff. I just think that is absolutely fascinating. And every once in a while, one of those balls will start to wobble, and they have to keep it going, Make sure it doesn't fall. But sadly, this is the way many well-meaning Christ followers live in the area of control versus security. You're just trying to keep everything up in the air all at once, thinking you're in control and experiencing real life. But dear friend, that's not real life. And I want to encourage you today to do something really dramatic. Let everything crash to the ground. Give control back to God and start focusing on the most important things. Your relationship with God and your fellowship with Him. Your family. Your church family. Your purpose. And if you don't know your purpose, seek it out and ask God and find your purpose in life. And then let every decision funnel through those priorities. Stop spinning all the balls. In a moment, as has been our habit in the last 2 weeks, the worship team's going to come back up and lead us and end our time together with a beautiful song on surrender, releasing control back to God. But I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention something that Pastor Dave pointed out last week. One of the saddest parts of this narrative is what Samuel asked Saul in the verses that we didn't read today. But do you remember Pastor Dave last week? Samuel says to him, all this is going on, and Samuel says to Saul, though you're little in your own eyes, aren't you the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel. Other translations of verse 17 say, are you so small in your own estimate, even though you're the head of the tribes of Israel? How could you do this? Do you think so little of yourself? You read the history of Samuel and the kings and David and Saul, and it's easy to see that Samuel knew the internal struggles of Saul, and he wanted so much for him. He wanted him to be a great king and a great leader. But Saul could not resist trying to control the situations in his life that made him feel uncomfortable or fearful. And if he was out of control, he did everything he could, no matter what, to regain control. He disobeyed the voice of God. He tried to control the outcome with manipulation, with blame, and he could never see himself as God saw him. Instead, he saw himself as little, and he always saw the moment as too big. If he'd only fallen back into the security of the very God who established him in the first place, he would have found true peace and wisdom to lead the people. And perhaps we would be talking about him like we do King David, the one who followed him as a man after God's own heart. I'd venture to guess, like me, many of you struggle with control. And I want to encourage you to let it go. To let go of greed. To let go of the manipulation and the pain, and pray and ask God, and through the power of the Holy Spirit, begin to see yourself as God sees you. If you've placed your faith and trust in Jesus, then you are a son of the Most High, majestic God that we sang about earlier. And things are going to fall apart and go wrong in your life, but you can always rest back in the security of who God says you are and the promises that He's made that you will be okay if you'll just be patient. Because the reality is you can't control anything. So I want to ask you to connect. There's 3 ways you can do that. Will you email us? We want to journey with you. We want to connect with you. We want to hear your story and hear what God is doing in your life. Pick up the phone and call us. Phone number's there on the screen. Give us a call. Let us talk with you or schedule a time to counsel with you. Or even better yet, if you're in the Pittsburgh region, will you come to one of our physical locations? You'll meet people there who are some of the most generous and loving and kind people in all of the Pittsburgh region. We'd like to get to know you and have coffee and spend time worshiping together. But I'm begging you to step out of anonymity and get help. Would you pray with me? God, I love you so much. And I'm so sorry for oftentimes thinking of myself as small, as insignificant, being concerned about appearances, and then not falling into your security and remembering who you say I am, but try to control the situation and manipulate other people and try to control the narrative and not wanting to share credit and because I'm just small on the inside. But God, you say that we are your creation, the crown jewel of your creation, that we're somebody. And I ask that you, through the power of your Spirit, would remind people that they are who you say they are. And you'd begin and do a good work in our heart on this issue of control. We love you and we praise you, and it's in your name we pray. Amen.